Picture a hardware store in small-town America in 1965. Fluorescent lights hum over bins of army surplus gear, canteens, helmets, ammo pouches, and near the back counter sits something that would be almost unthinkable today. A bin of hand grenades, sold for a couple of dollars apiece, no license required, no questions asked. For a brief and strange window in American history, that scene was real, and almost nobody talks about it now. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to 1945, the moment the guns fell silent, and the United States found itself drowning in the largest surplus of military hardware the world had ever seen. Factories that had spent years turning out rifles, tanks, ammunition, and ordnance by the millions suddenly had no war left to fight. Warehouses across the country and overseas were stacked floor to ceiling with equipment nobody needed anymore, at least not for its original purpose. The government faced an enormous logistical and financial problem. What do you do with a mountain of weapons when the war that justified building them is over? The answer, in part, was to sell it. Under the Surplus Property Act of 1944, the federal government began liquidating enormous quantities of wartime material through public auctions and surplus stores. Jeeps, tents, uniforms, radios, and tools flooded into civilian life this way, fueling a boom in Army-Navy surplus stores that would remain a fixture of American main streets for decades. Much of this was mundane. But ordnance, the grenades, the flares, the ammunition, required special handling before it could legally reach a store shelf. That handling was called deactivation. Deactivated ordnance meant a grenade, shell, or piece of live ammunition that had been rendered inert. The explosive filler was removed, the fuse mechanism disabled, sometimes the casing was drilled or plugged to make functioning impossible. Once demilled, demilitarized, these items were, on paper, no more dangerous than a paperweight. And that reclassification is what allowed surplus stores to legally sell things like grenade bodies, shell casings, and other ordnance-shaped curiosities to ordinary customers without a federal firearms license. For collectors, veterans, and curious teenagers alike, they became cheap, exotic souvenirs of a war that was still fresh in the nation's memory. A deactivated grenade on a shelf or a mantle wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a conversation piece. But here's where the story gets murkier, and where you have to be careful separating fact from surplus store legend. Enforcement of demilitarization standards in the immediate post-war decades was inconsistent. Regulations existed, but the sheer volume of material moving through military disposal channels, combined with limited inspection resources, meant that not everything labeled inert was reliably inert, and not everything sold was properly checked at all. Over the years, there have been documented cases of surplus ordnance turning out to be only partially deactivated, or of collectors and hobbyists discovering, sometimes the hard way, that a dummy grenade or shell still contained active components. These stories surface periodically even today, when old grenades bought decades ago at a surplus counter turn up in an attic or estate sale, and a bomb squad has to be called in. Not because someone was doing anything sinister, but because a piece of 1950s surplus never had its explosive charge properly removed in the first place. This is the part of the story that made the era genuinely dangerous, and it's also the part that's hardest to pin down with a precise, verified number. Popular accounts and surplus store folklore often cite huge figures, hundreds of thousands of grenades moving through the post-war civilian market. But these figures are difficult to verify against surviving government records, and estimates vary widely depending on the source. What can be said with confidence is that military surplus ordnance, in genuinely large quantities, entered civilian hands through legal channels for roughly 2 decades after the war, and that the deactivation process, while intended to make these items harmless, was not always executed to a standard that would satisfy modern safety regulators. That uneasy arrangement lasted through the 1950s and into the 1960s, propped up by a legal framework that had never fully anticipated just how much wartime ordnance would end up on civilian shelves. Then, in the second half of the 1960s, the politics of firearms regulation in America shifted dramatically. A string of high-profile assassinations and rising concern about violent crime pushed Congress toward the most sweeping overhaul of federal gun law since the 1930s. The result was the Gun Control Act of 1968. The 1968 Act didn't just tighten rules on handguns and rifles, it expanded the legal definition of a destructive device to explicitly include grenades, bombs, mines, and similar explosive ordnance, folding them into the same strict regulatory category that had governed machine guns since the National Firearms Act of 1934. Overnight, the legal landscape for surplus ordnance changed completely. A grenade, deactivated or not, was no longer a curiosity you could buy over the counter with a couple of dollars and a smile. It was now a regulated destructive device, subject to registration, taxation, and, in most cases, a lengthy and expensive federal licensing process through the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. For an inert novelty item that had cost less than a movie ticket a few years earlier, the new compliance burden made ordinary retail sale essentially impossible. Surplus stores across the country had to adapt almost immediately. Shelves that had once displayed rows of grenade bodies, shell casings, and other deactivated ordnance were cleared out. Some dealers destroyed their remaining stock outright, rather than deal with the new paperwork. Others quietly sold off what they had before the law took full effect, which is part of why so many of these items still surface in flea markets, garage sales, and inherited collections today. They were purchased legally, in that narrow window before 1968, and have simply been sitting in basements and closets ever since. Still others became dealers of record, obtaining the specialized federal licenses needed to legally handle destructive devices for the smaller, more serious collector market that persists to this day. The human side of this story is what makes it more than a footnote in regulatory history. For a generation of American boys who grew up in the shadow of World War II, an inert grenade from the surplus store wasn't a weapon. It was a piece of the war their fathers and uncles had fought in, something you could hold in your hand and imagine yourself into the story. Veterans themselves sometimes bought these items as keepsakes, tangible reminders of a chapter of their lives that was otherwise gone. Collectors built entire assemblages of demilitarized ordnance, treating them the way others might collect coins or stamps. That culture didn't disappear after 1968, but it was pushed underground into a much smaller, much more regulated hobbyist world, governed by federal license rather than a cash register. What lingers from this era isn't just nostalgia, it's a genuine public safety legacy. Bomb disposal units in the United States still occasionally respond to calls involving old military surplus ordnance, grenades bought decades ago that turn out, on inspection, not to be as inert as their sellers believed. Every so often a news story surfaces about a family finding a harmless souvenir grenade in a late relative's belongings, only for authorities to determine it needs professional disposal. These aren't signs of some hidden conspiracy. They're the long tail of a post-war system that mixed genuine demilitarization with inconsistent oversight. At a moment when the country was more focused on absorbing millions of returning soldiers and mountains of surplus hardware than on tightly regulating every last piece of ordnance moving through it. Looked at from today, the whole episode feels almost impossible to imagine. A hand grenade for a couple of dollars, no background check, no license, sitting on a shelf between canteens and old field jackets. But it makes more sense in the context of its time. The country had just emerged from the largest mobilization in its history, was still working out how to absorb an ocean of wartime material back into civilian life, and hadn't yet built the regulatory architecture that we now take for granted. The Gun Control Act of 1968 closed that chapter for good. folding grenades and other destructive devices into a legal category that made casual civilian ownership effectively impossible. What's left today are the artifacts: deactivated shells in glass display cases, grenade-shaped lamps and paperweights in antique shops, and the occasional real find in an old footlocker that still, after all these decades, requires a call to the bomb squad rather than a garage sale price tag. It's a strange and largely forgotten corner of post-war American life, proof that the transition from total war to peacetime commerce was messier and in places more dangerous than most history books ever mention. If you found something like this in an attic or basement, the current correct guidance is simple and doesn't rely on any nostalgia. Don't move it or handle it, and contact local law enforcement or a bomb disposal unit right away, since decades-old deactivated ordnance can't always be trusted to be as harmless as its original label claimed. If stories like this, the strange, half-forgotten corners of the post-war world, are the kind of history you want more of, that's exactly the kind of thing worth digging into next.